The hearing room was electric, pulsing with nervous energy. Journalists gripped their pens as flashes cut across the mahogany walls, capturing every twitch of expression. Whispers slithered like smoke, the kind of hushed chatter that always fills a room when everyone knows a collision is coming. It wasn't just a committee meeting, it was theater, the stage where egos clash and legacies are written. At the center sat Elon Musk, reclined casually in his chair, fingers steepled, a faint smirk curling. He looked less like a witness before Congress and more like a king surveying his court. As the chair yielded him the floor, Musk leaned forward, his tone light but dripping with smug certainty. "Free speech," he began, pausing as if the words themselves carried divine weight, "is absolute. You don't get to decide which voices matter, and you certainly don't get to silence the ones you don't like. If someone is offended, that's their problem. That's freedom." The statement hung heavy in the air. For a split second, silence swallowed the chamber. Then small gasps erupted, scattered across the audience like sparks from a fire. Committee staffers exchanged worried glances. A few smirked nervously, glancing down at their notes as though unsure whether they too might suddenly be put on trial in the court of his arrogance. Cameras pivoted with precision, zooming in on Musk's face. The unflinching eyes, the controlled swagger. He didn't merely believe what he said, he relished it, wearing the shock he provoked as a crown. To him, outrage was not a risk, it was the point. And tonight he was determined to own the stage. But in the seats reserved a few rows down, Jasmine Crockett listened without a flinch. Her hands rested firmly on the table, her eyes sharp, not distracted, not intimidated. Every word Musk laid down she absorbed, storing it like ammunition in the arsenal of her mind. Around her, the gasps receded to whispers, but she remained still, her silence louder than the chaos circling the room. Musk's words still echoed, absolute, unrestricted, untouchable. He leaned back again, grinning as if daring anyone to challenge him, and the audience wondered, would anyone even try? They didn't know it yet, but in seconds, Musk's confidence would meet a wall of fire, and the rebuttal he was about to face would stop him cold. The cameras didn't waver, they stayed locked on Musk as though he were the only story worth telling. But the truth, the real drama, wasn't in his familiar platitudes about freedom. It was in the reason he sat here at all, the storm that had dragged him into this chamber under oath. Twitter, now rebranded with his chosen emblem X, had become a battlefield the moment Musk seized control. He promised a new era of free speech, tearing down old guardrails in the name of absolutism. But in the vacuum of those vanished safeguards came a tidal wave, disinformation campaigns unchecked, hate speech swelling to brazen visibility, conspiracy theories spreading with algorithmic gasoline. To some, he was a liberator. To others, he was the match poised over democracy's dry kindling. The controversies multiplied. Political candidates weaponized his platform to shout louder, spread faster. Extremists dusted off old rhetoric with newfound confidence, finding audiences turbocharged by Musk's algorithms. Ordinary users, teachers, store clerks, migrants, teenagers, found themselves harassed, silenced not by government censors but by mobs empowered under the banner of absolute speech. What was supposed to feel like liberation instead felt to many like an ambush. That was why he was here, not just as an entrepreneur defending technology, but as a billionaire defending philosophy. The stakes had warped beyond code or content guidelines. Lawmakers recognized something sharper hidden beneath, the question of whose voices might count in America's conversation and whose might be drowned out forever. This wasn't about toggling a setting on a platform, it was about the essence of belonging, identity, and dignity. Every immigrant child who'd been told to go back, every LGBTQ kid bombarded with hate, every working woman targeted by faceless trolls, they all had something riding on what would unfold in this room. Would freedom be defined as the right of the strongest to speak unchecked, or as the balance between voice and humanity? It was into this high-stakes churn that Jasmine Crockett sat silent, steady. For long minutes she did not so much as adjust her seat, her posture radiating patience, even inevitability. To most, she was underestimated, or worse, overlooked entirely. A freshman congresswoman, young, black, a woman, a figure the machinery of arrogance rarely anticipated as its fiercest obstruction. Musk barely regarded her presence, his eyes flitting instead to cameras and ally faces, assuming the power dynamic was already settled. But Crockett had been here before in what felt like 100 different forms. Overlooked, dismissed, patronized, and yet always, eventually impossible to ignore. Her silence was not weakness. It was preparation. The committee chair shuffled papers, gearing for the next lines of questioning. Musk leaned back again, waiting. The room buzzed, not unlike a coiled spring, one everyone knew could snap at any second. And though the audience at home didn't know it, though Musk certainly didn't, soon the words that poured from Crockett's mouth would lance through the bravado with surgical precision. It wouldn't just be a response. It wouldn't just be one more round in the shouting match of political culture wars. When she finally spoke, the room would shift. Reporters would rush to file emergency headlines. Clips would explode across timelines. Reactions would cascade from living rooms to cable studios to social networks themselves. Because when she finally spoke, the internet would never be the same. Elon Musk wasn't just another witness dragged before a committee. He was a spectacle unto himself, a man who had carefully curated, yet carelessly wielded, a persona larger than the platforms he owned. To millions, he was the living embodiment of disruption, the billionaire who claimed to move fast, break rules, and bend the future to his liking. Rockets, cars, satellites, each venture served as proof of his reach. And now, with his takeover of Twitter rebranded as X, Musk believed he had seized something even more elemental, the public square itself. He styled himself as a free speech warrior, untethered and uncompromising. His followers loved him for it. They hailed him as the last guardian against cancel culture, retweeting his quips and memes with near religious fervor. Online, his quotes were plastered across profile bios and comment threads, words reshaped into doctrine for those who feared their voices were fading. For Musk, validation was never organic. It was algorithmic, delivered in likes, retweets, and viral surges that fed his sense of inevitability. But beneath that image, contradictions whispered loudly. While Musk declared speech should be absolute, stories surfaced of his selective silencing. Critics who mocked him too sharply found their accounts restricted or mysteriously suspended. Journalists who probed too deeply found themselves blocked outright by the man who claimed to despise censorship. To his admirers, these actions were justification. To his detractors, they were evidence of hypocrisy dressed as freedom. The paradox only sharpened under scrutiny. When hate surged on the platform, targeting immigrants, racial minorities, and marginalized communities, Musk insisted it was the price of liberty, even as those victims begged for basic protection. They weren't billionaires with their own satellites. They were everyday citizens caught between earning a living online and enduring harassment that bled into their offline lives. For them, absolute speech wasn't principle, it was punishment handed down by someone who would never personally endure its costs. In hearings like this, Musk performed with a kind of brazen confidence, leaning back in his chair as if gravity applied differently to him. His presence radiated wealth, power, the smirk of a man convinced that the rules shattering against him were mere glass inconveniences, not steel restraints. To his critics, that arrogance wasn't a shield, it was a tell, the flash of overconfidence before collapse. Yet he had reason to believe himself untouchable. Wealth had insulated him from those who shouted back. Power had taught him audiences preferred spectacle to nuance. And millions of his followers functioned as a human echo chamber, reinforcing the idea that his way of seeing the world was the way it must be seen. Musk bathed in that conviction. In his mind, these lawmakers weren't opponents, they were props. He was starring in his own debate drama, one where his sound bites would ricochet across the internet long after the session adjourned. But arrogance has gravity too. It pulls a person toward inevitability, toward the moment when the audience shifts, when laughter at your joke sounds less sincere, when your declarations are met not with applause but with weary eyes tired of performance. That undercurrent was in the room tonight, even if Musk hadn't yet noticed it. The smirks didn't last as long. The note-taking was sharper, angrier. Journalists weren't leaning back to observe him. They were leaning forward, ready to catch the first stumble. Because for all his talk of freedom, Musk had made himself the center of his own philosophy. And the cracks showed clearest when measured against the simplest truth. In Musk's world, free speech was absolute only when he wasn't the one feeling its sting. The irony was almost cinematic. The man who claimed to deliver liberty from above, perched high in wealth beyond imagination, had never felt the choke of oppression from below. He had never sat in the dark of an apartment on a weeknight and watched a mob online strip bare your dignity with words. He had never carried immigrant parents' stories of silence or faced down centuries of mockery wrapped up in a single sentence of hate. And in that room, unseen by him, sat someone who carried all of it. Someone who knew that freedom wasn't an abstraction but a lived reality, speaking when the world tried to quiet you, pushing forward when power shoved you aside. But while Musk saw himself as untouchable, one lawmaker's life story gave her a very different grounding. Long before she stood beneath the bright, merciless lights of a congressional hearing, Jasmine Crockett lived a reality far removed from the world of rockets and billion-dollar buyouts. Her story began not with venture capital or Silicon Valley applause, but in neighborhoods often overlooked by promises of progress. She came of age in places where opportunity wasn't handed out, it had to be carved out. And in those spaces, whispered into the earshot of a young black girl who dared to dream, were the steady refrains, "You can't, you won't, you shouldn't even try." Crockett had heard them all. She had heard those voices, and she had learned to answer not with words but with persistence. In school, she worked harder, not because she wanted recognition, but because she knew invisibility was the greater risk. While others were excused for mistakes, she was told to prove herself twice over. While doors cracked open for some, she pried them open herself, pulling others through behind her. It was this relentlessness, this refusal to accept invisibility, that braided itself into the very DNA of her journey. Her family's story was one of resilience, of ordinary sacrifice knitted together into extraordinary endurance. Their lives didn't unfold on glossy magazine covers, but at kitchen tables where bills were shuffled like puzzle pieces, trying to make ends meet. Her parents taught her not only survival but dignity in that survival. They taught her that character was not what you flaunted but what you carried when the world dismissed your worth. This grounding gave her a compass Musk had never known, a map not of boardrooms and billion-dollar projections, but of lived struggle. Her path into law wasn't simply ambition, it was necessity. Crockett entered courtrooms not as an elite protected by privilege, but as an advocate for those who had nothing but their stories and their pleas. She represented the overlooked, the black and brown communities forgotten when resources dried up, the vulnerable pitted against powers that assumed they'd never be challenged. For the people she defended, these halls of justice weren't theoretical debates. They were the difference between shattered futures and second chances. It was in those spaces that Crockett sharpened her voice, not for spectacle, but out of obligation, to confront prosecutors dismissing lives as numbers, to fight systems that claimed neutrality but perpetuated imbalance, to make sure that even the most marginalized clients left knowing someone had stood beside them when others turned away. That fire forged her into something relentless, and it didn't fade when she traded courthouse doors for congressional chambers. Her seat in the U.S. House wasn't won with the sweep of notoriety or the gravitational pull of a global audience. It was earned the old-fashioned way, tireless canvassing, listening to constituents in crowded community centers, campaigning block by block. She didn't inherit celebrity, she earned credibility. She learned politics not as a ladder to climb, but as a duty to represent people who had been unheard for too long. That contrast to Elon Musk was not incidental, it was monumental. He arrived in the world stage carried by wealth and the privilege of power. She clawed her way into it through grit and grassroots resilience. He could buy arenas. She built trust in living rooms and sidewalks. Where his claims to truth echoed in shareholder calls, hers rang out in the streets of America itself, reflecting the anxieties and dignity of everyday lives. And identity was not an abstraction for Crockett, it was her lived armor. Being a woman, being black, being underestimated, these weren't inconveniences on her way to the spotlight. They were the very crucible that made her voice sharp, her footing firm, her rage measured and righteous. She belonged to America not as a mogul writing checks, but as a daughter, a fighter, a public servant whose story matched the pulse of ordinary people. Sitting in the hearing now, her silence wasn't the quiet of hesitation. It was the quiet of someone who had fought too hard, risen too far, and endured too much to be rattled by arrogance. She didn't require applause to confirm her significance. She didn't need retweets to echo her worth. Crockett's faith was grounded not in metrics but in the unshakable understanding that dignity has the final word. The audience watching her wouldn't know yet why her calm felt so potent. They couldn't yet predict how her words would slice through the noise, but instinctively they sensed it. Here was someone who wasn't playing Musk's game of bravado and ego. She was playing a deeper game, the one about truth, justice, and survival. And as Musk's smirk lingered, as his certainty seemed to dominate the room, few realized that Crockett's silence was the most powerful presence there. She wasn't biding time, she was waiting for the moment where experience would conquer entitlement and where lived struggle would dwarf inherit aid wealth. This was the preparation Musk could never match. The hum of the hearing stretched into silence, the kind of silence that felt heavier than sound itself. Musk had finished another sweeping declaration, leaning back with the ease of a man convinced the room was his stage. Reporters busied themselves scribbling, analysts drafted tweets mid-thought. Then came the moment no one expected. Jasmine Crockett adjusted her microphone. At first, her tone was measured, almost conversational. "Mr. Musk," she began, her voice steady, "you've described free speech as absolute. But do you understand what it feels like when that absolutism turns into a weapon targeting ordinary people who don't have your wealth or your shield of power?" Musk chuckled lightly, the sound dismissive, almost rehearsed. "Congresswoman," he interrupted swiftly, raising an eyebrow, "speech is messy. It's not my job to babysit the internet. People can choose who they listen to. Offense is not harm. It's part of a free society." His confidence earned a few scattered nods from allies in the chamber, but Crockett didn't blink. She sat straighter, eyes narrowing, her words sharp as a scalpel. "Funny," she replied with precision, "how ending up the butt of a meme seems trivial to you until it's you who doesn't like the jokes." The room shifted. Reporters glanced up, alert, pens snapping back to paper. Musk smirked again, brushing her jab aside with practiced bravado. "Oh, I don't mind criticism. I get it every day. But free speech means the bad comes with the good. To stifle one is to erase the other. That's basic logic." His voice filled the hearing, confident, booming with the cadence of someone used to winning arguments, not by substance but by sheer force of presence. He leaned forward now, commanding the committee with sweeping gestures, as if he were giving a TED talk rather than being cross-examined. But Crockett's calm had an edge that sharpens only under pressure. She waited for his voice to fall back into a smug pause. Then, with the precision of someone unwilling to be steamrolled, she pressed again. "So your logic is that if a teenager is swarmed with racial slurs and death threats for existing as they are, that's just the price of freedom? You're telling every parent watching this hearing that safety online is expendable in your pursuit of abstract ideals?" The gasps this time were audible. Even behind desks, even in press rows, people's pens hung mid-air. Musk waved a hand, dismissing her framing. "That's not what I said," he countered quickly, his voice rising. "You're twisting it. Freedom means people can say what they want, even if it's ugly. Policing that ugliness is not my responsibility. If you ban one kind of speech, you ban them all. It's a slippery slope." His words collided with the air like thunder, but something had shifted. The tension in the room thickened, no longer in Musk's control. Every word Crockett had spoken cut past the abstractions, reminding the audience of the lived human reality. Musk's absolutism obscured, his tone grew sharper, his interjections more frantic, as though the very calm she radiated forced him into discomfort. Each time he interrupted, Ted Crockett returned with pointed clarity, her pace unhurried while his voice barreled ahead. Spectators felt the contrast grow, her composure against his bluster, her grounded truth against his philosophical posturing. It was no longer just an exchange, it was a duel, and Musk, for the first time, looked like a man fighting to keep the stage that had always come freely to him. The clash escalated in waves like two storms colliding on the horizon. Musk's interruptions grew louder, his laughter more brittle, trying to drown her words. But Crockett's voice, precise and unwavering, cut through each attempt. It wasn't anger that carried her, it was authority born of lived struggle. And in that charged back and forth, the energy in the room no longer belonged to him. Everyone felt it, though no one could yet articulate it. Something had changed, the control had slipped. The air was no longer bending around Musk's bravado. Something else was forcing the room to listen. And then everything shifted. Crockett unleashed the words that froze Musk in his seat. Crockett leaned forward, her voice low at first, carrying the cadence of someone who didn't need volume to command attention. The silence that followed Musk's bluster opened into a space only she could fill, and when she spoke, her words cut like glass. "Mr. Musk," she began evenly, "you paint free speech like it's your invention, something you alone bestow by flipping a switch. But for millions of Americans, especially those of us who come from the margins, speech isn't free at all. It's costly, it costs safety, it costs dignity, it costs belonging. And when hate goes unchecked under your watch, it isn't freedom being exercised, it's freedom being stolen." A murmur rippled across the room. Reporters jolted upright, fingers racing as if afraid their screens might miss a word. Cameras zoomed in tightly, capturing Musk's expression as his smirk faltered for the briefest second. He shifted in his chair, a hand brushing against the microphone. Crockett allowed that pause to linger, just an extra beat, the silence pregnant with anticipation, every second turning the focus away from his image and onto her presence. You claim, she continued steadily, that offense isn't harm. But tell that to the immigrant who logs onto your platform after 12 hours of hard work only to see hundreds of strangers shouting they should go back. Tell it to the teenager whose face is turned into a meme for ridicule because of the color of their skin. Tell it to the family that closes their laptops each night in fear their address will be leaked because a mob doesn't like their existence. Gasps sounded audibly. A staffer seated behind Musk lowered his eyes, jaw tightening. Musk cracked a smile, but it was thin now, brittle at the edges. He tried to interrupt. That's not... But Crockett pressed through. Freedom of speech isn't the freedom to brutalize others into silence. That's not democracy, that's domination. And domination has no place dressed up as liberty. The chamber seemed to tilt. Cameras caught Musk glaring, his lips twitching as if to summon a retort. He leaned into his microphone, blurting, "Congresswoman, you don't understand scale? Billions of posts, algorithms, chaos. I can't police feelings." Feelings? Crockett's voice hardened, her eyes narrowing as she leaned forward. This isn't about feelings. This is about lives. About whether a kid bullied into despair still has tomorrow. About whether parents can bury their loved ones knowing an incitement online pushed it too far. You want to make this about your philosophy? I'm making it about people. The room erupted with a suppressed gasp, a wave of murmurs bouncing between walls. Even journalists, jaded by years of hearings, lifted their eyes, exchanging sharp glances that silently screamed, "She's landing blows." Musk opened his mouth, but the words hung limp, tangled in constraints of his own contradictions. He shifted again, shoulders pushing back as though posture alone could restore dominance. "No one here, no one, cares more about free expression than me," he tried, the arrogance now laced with defensive urgency. Crockett gave him the smallest of smiles, the kind honed over years of fighting uphill. "No, Mr. Musk, what you care about is attention, and there's a difference. Free speech isn't about whether you get to be the loudest man in the room. It's about whether the quiet voices get to survive in it." The words landed with a thud, deliberate, shattering something in the air. The audience recoiled with audible exclamations, notes of disbelief and awe crashing together. Every camera swiveled. Journalists typed frantically. On Twitter, in real time, the first fragments of her speech were already going viral. Musk fumbled for a response. "Look, silence is the worst thing we could do to humanity. We need the chaos. We need the noise." Crockett nodded once, patient, but her reply was surgical. Noise without accountability is not freedom, it's tyranny by volume. And what you call chaos, others call collapse. What you dismiss as a price of liberty, people are paying with their safety, their careers, their very lives. A heavy hush dropped. Musk tried to laugh it off, the brittle chuckle of a man clinging to charm, but the cameras caught his tightened jaw, the bead of sweat rising near his collar. His aura of untouchability cracked. Crockett steadied herself, raised her chin, and let her words gather force for what became the crescendo of her speech. Free speech isn't holy because billionaires can shout louder than the rest. Free speech is sacred because it is tethered to truth, dignity, and responsibility. Strip it of those and you don't have freedom. You have chaos masquerading as power. So no, Mr. Musk, free speech is not your toy, it is not your brand, it is not your shiny new label on a broken system. Free speech belongs to the people. All of them. And until you understand that protecting speech also means protecting people, you'll never know what freedom really is. The room exploded in a volley of sounds, gasps, applause, clamped down by the gavel, camera shutters firing like gunfire. Musk stared, wounded pride flickering across a face unaccustomed to public unraveling. Crockett sat back, composure intact, calm and unruffled. She didn't need volume. She didn't need power. In that moment, her words became the gravity of the hearing, pulling every ear into her orbit, leaving Musk adrift. The murmurs spread like sparks catching wind. Staffers whispered, journalists pressed send. And far beyond the walls of that hearing, phones across America lit up with live-streamed clips of what they had just witnessed. Because one thing was certain, the fallout of her takedown would explode far beyond that room. It took less than 5 minutes for the clip to detonate across the internet. By the time Musk had left the hearing room, the moment was already everywhere, spliced, subtitled, turned into memes, remixed with triumphant soundtracks. Hashtags surged onto trending lists at lightning speed. Crockett clapback, had free speech with dignity, # drop moment. Twitter itself, his own platform, his prized experiment in absolute freedom, was the epicenter of the eruption. Irony dripped from every post as users celebrated how the man who prided himself on controlling the online narrative had just been publicly dismantled on his very stage. Clips of Crockett's steady gaze locked against Musk's faltering defense looped endlessly, framed with captions like, "That's how you check a billionaire," and finally, someone said it. Within hours, celebrities weighed in. Musicians and comedians recorded reaction videos, laughing, gasping, even replaying Crockett's final line like it was a chorus. Progressive politicians co-signed the takedown with their own posts, praising her as the embodiment of truth cutting through bluster. Even some of Musk's previous allies, uncomfortable with the sight of his unraveling, offered muted statements, admitting, if only indirectly, that Crockett had struck a nerve worth acknowledging. Late-night hosts tasted blood, their monologues lit up with sharp-edged jokes about Musk's dismantling, clips of his increasingly brittle chuckles played back for laughs juxtaposed against Crockett's calm, unforgettable delivery. Editorials poured out. The Washington Post hailed her words as a reclaiming of free speech for the vulnerable, while think pieces across digital platforms trended under headlines like, "When the billionaire met someone he couldn't interrupt." But it wasn't just media elites who amplified the impact, it was ordinary people. Teachers, nurses, frontline workers, immigrants, teenagers, all found themselves reflected in Crockett's message. Comment sections filled with stories. "That's exactly how I felt online and no one cared," wrote one young woman. "For once I feel seen," another echoed. The replies multiplied, weaving into a communal testimony where individuals long silenced by hate speech now felt vicariously represented through her words. The memes, though, carried their own punch. Screenshots of Musk, mid-grimace, were coupled with captions mocking his bravado, "When free speech meets real accountability." Others pasted Crockett's words into graphic designs and posters, turning her mic drop into slogans worthy of marches and rallies. Online, she was trending not just as a politician, but as a symbol. Behind the comedy and commentary, however, something deeper stirred. The conversation shifted from mere ridicule into reflection. Was this the turning point in the way America saw digital speech? Was the tide finally shifting away from billionaire dominance to grassroots dignity? Crockett, without chasing it, had sparked a cultural moment. Meanwhile, Musk retreated into tweets of his own. His defenders rallied hashtags like #OffFreeMusk speech posting that he had been ambushed, silenced, misrepresented. But the numbers told another story. The hashtags supporting Crockett outpaced his by millions. The ripple effect widened. Universities held impromptu forums discussing the exchange. Advocacy groups cited Crockett's words in press releases demanding stronger protections for marginalized users online. Pundits debated endlessly on cable news. Was this truly an ideological reckoning or just a soundbite in the endless churn of culture wars? Yet even in that swirl, the truth was undeniable. Musk had been rattled, and Crockett had crystallized a new narrative. In living rooms across the nation, families sat together replaying the clip, pointing to Crockett's figure on screen as more than a politician, as proof that dignity can disarm arrogance. Teenagers messaged links to their group chats, writing simply, "This is who I want to be when I grow up." The viral moment had exceeded itself. It transcended the committee walls, turning from testimony into testimony's afterlife. It was no longer just Crockett delivering a takedown. It was an audience long silence finding resonance in her words. It wasn't just a moment, it became a movement. And as the dust settled, as America scrolled through timelines pulsing with Crockett's defiance and Musk's shaken mask, one question remained hovering like static. If this clash revealed the cracks in arrogance, what was the lesson buried beneath it all? But what was the deeper lesson behind all this drama? In the days that followed, the frenzy of memes, clips, and headlines began to settle into something steadier, something deeper. Beyond the amusement of a billionaire's faltering bravado, beyond the viral delight of a perfect mic drop, people returned to Crockett's words with a more serious reverence. Her dismantling of Musk's absolutism had not simply been a takedown, it had been a teaching moment, one stitched into the fabric of what America had always struggled to define, what true freedom really means. For Crockett, the lesson was clear. Free speech, when wielded carelessly, was not freedom at all, it was destruction. Real liberty did not belong to those who shouted the loudest or those who could amplify themselves through wealth and platforms. Real liberty endured only when speech coexisted with empathy, responsibility, and dignity. Her framing was not meant to silence dissent, but to elevate humanity. In that reframing, she offered something far greater than a win in a committee room. She offered clarity in a culture choking on noise. Musk had made arrogance his currency, mocking opposition with the breezy entitlement of someone untethered from consequence. Crockett, by contrast, rooted her response in truth drawn from lived experience. Her closing lesson carried the weight of authenticity, a resonance that no algorithm, no meme, no billionaire swagger could ever manufacture. She reminded America that freedom unmoored from responsibility corrodes from within, collapsing into demagoguery disguised as liberty. And in that reminder, she reclaimed the ground on which democratic values could stand. What stirred people most wasn't just her composure under pressure, it was what that composure represented. Dignity over mockery, empathy over ego, democracy over demagoguery. These weren't just abstract ideals, they were the unglamorous truths of everyday lives in neighborhoods that rarely made headlines. Parents telling their children to hold their heads high, workers shouldering disrespect while carving out survival, migrants clinging to hope despite rejection. The lesson was that America's promise had never rested in the volume of the powerful, but in the resilience of the ordinary. The crescendo of her message was this: Americanness itself is not defined by who dominates the microphone or who controls the feed. It is defined by the collective resilience of millions, voices too often dismissed, yet voices that keep repeating their truths despite the noise. In that resilience, Crockett argued, lies the real torchlight of democracy, a flame not controlled by billionaires but carried by the people. Viewers who had come for entertainment left with goosebumps. Her final words rang less like a takedown and more like a creed, a vision that raised the stakes far above her clash with Musk. This wasn't about one billionaire or one hearing or one hashtag. It was about reclaiming America itself from arrogance and mockery back into dignity and fellowship. As the clip replayed one final time in living rooms, classrooms, and news roundtables across the country, an unexpected thing happened. People didn't just cheer, they reflected. They remembered the times they had been mocked for accent, or silenced for identity, or overlooked in rooms where arrogance commanded attention. And they felt restored, reminded that truth spoken with clarity and courage still had power to cut through the din. Crockett had not only forced Musk to rethink his own words, she had forced a nation to rethink its own values. She had turned a clash into a mirror, offering every viewer a reflection of what America could still be if it chose dignity over dismissal. And in that moment, inspiration eclipsed outrage. The movement wasn't about silencing, the movement was about hearing. The audience left not just entertained but uplifted, moved, inspired. They walked away not with Musk's hollow insistence on chaos, but with Crockett's vision of resilience. One that whispers still, justice is not noise, it is presence. Democracy is not domination, it is participation. And Americanness is not arrogance, it is dignity. Elon Musk walked into that chamber certain of his dominance. He came prepared to lecture the nation about freedom, convinced that his vision of absolute speech was untouchable. But what he didn't expect was Jasmine Crockett, a woman whose calm resilience, lived struggle, and unwavering clarity would transform that hearing into a reckoning. By the time she finished, the billionaire who prided himself on making others rethink had been forced into reflection himself. And that is the true story of this clash. It wasn't just about Musk versus Crockett. It was about arrogance meeting authenticity, privilege meeting perseverance, ego meeting empathy. It was about who gets to define freedom and who pays the price when freedom is stripped of responsibility. Crockett reminded us of something so many had nearly forgotten. Truth and justice are not luxuries belonging to billionaires. They are rights that belong to everyone. To the child drowned out by hate online. To the immigrant mocked for their accent, to the worker dismissed as invisible, to every American who believes democracy means being heard without being humiliated. Tonight's lesson is bigger than Musk, bigger than polity. CES, bigger than one committee hearing. It is the reminder that we, the people, own the meaning of freedom. And when voices like Crockett's rise, we are all invited to reclaim it together. So now it falls to you. Don't just watch, respond. Don't just nod, act. Share this story, add your voice in the comments, and join a movement that insists dignity matters as much as debate, and that justice is not a gift from the powerful but the birthright of us all. Because Musk may have walked out rethinking everything, and maybe by standing together, so will America.